It is a privilege for InfraCorp to join the Rural Electrification Agency and the Ministry of Finance Incorporated in welcoming you to the launch of the Renewable Asset Management Company, RAMCO. Let me begin with a very simple question. What happens to an infrastructure project after the commissioning ceremony is over? We spend enormous amounts of time, effort, and capital designing, financing, and building infrastructure. We celebrate when it is commissioned, but the real economic life of that asset is only beginning at the point of commissioning. The question then is, who takes responsibility for ensuring that that project, that infrastructure continues to work, that it is properly maintained, that its performance is monitored, that it is renewed when necessary, and that the value of the original investment is preserved over 20 or 30 years. Ladies and gentlemen, that in a nutshell is the problem RAMCO has been created to address. Our normal conversations about infrastructure projects concentrate more on how we build and commission the projects. I believe you agree with me that this is only half of the infrastructure question. The other half is how we manage, maintain, finance, and preserve those assets throughout their economic lives. One gets the project built, the other keeps the infrastructure project working. So permit me to make my first assertion. Infrastructure does not create value simply because it has been commissioned. Infrastructure creates value because it continues to work. A power plant creates value when it reliably produces electricity. A solar installation creates value when the panels and batteries and inverters and distribution systems continue performing years after commissioning. A mini grid creates value when customers continue to receive reliable power and sufficient revenues are generated to operate, maintain, and eventually renew the assets. Therefore, we must move from simply asking the question, what infrastructure have we built, to asking a new set of questions. How well are our infrastructure assets performing? Who is accountable for them? How are we maintaining them? How do we preserve and grow their value over the decades ahead? These questions are particularly relevant in the case of renewable energy assets. Through programs like the Energizing Education Program, the Nigerian Electrification Program, the National Public Sector Solarization Initiative, and other interventions, Nigeria is progressively building a substantial portfolio of renewable energy infrastructure assets across universities, across our teaching hospitals, in our public institutions, in our communities. These are extremely important national investments and deserve to be celebrated, with special kudos to REA and the Ministry of Power. These investments are powering learning, healthcare, public services, and economic activity. But for every dollar or naira that is invested in these assets create a corresponding obligation to preserve their value. And that is precisely why the stewardship of RAMCO now exists to provide. Ladies and gentlemen, for simplicity, let me submit to you that every infrastructure asset really has two lives. The first life is what we call the project life or the construction phase, during which the asset is conceived, designed, financed, procured, constructed, and eventually commissioned. You see, REA and its partners will continue to do that work, developing renewable energy infrastructure across Nigeria and bringing new assets into service. But the commissioning of any asset, any project begins the second life of that asset, which I will call the operational and the economic life of that asset, the economic phase of that asset. And that second life is much longer and ultimately where the value of the original investment is realized. So for the next 20 to 30 years, somebody must take responsibility for how that asset performs, maintaining it, monitoring it, optimizing it, renewing it, restoring underperforming assets, and ensuring that it continues to deliver service for which it was built. Concretely, what that means is that they require professional life cycle asset management, which covers knowing the condition and performance of the assets, implementing preventative and corrective maintenance, monitoring and collecting data, maximizing revenue assurance, managing life cycle investment and renewal, driving commercial optimization, and confronting assets that are either stranded or underperforming so they can be rehabilitated and returned to the productive use rather than simply being abandoned or replaced. RAMCO is designed to institutionalize these responsibilities for that second life of the asset. In simple terms, REA and its partners will continue to help Nigeria to build renewable infrastructure. But RAMCO will help ensure that what we build keeps working and keep delivering value to Nigeria. So therefore, I submit to you that we must move from simply building projects to managing assets, and from managing assets to creating sustainable infrastructure value. But making such a shift requires the correct institutional design. We are deliberately not asking one institution to do everything. REA brings sector leadership, the assets, the technical expertise, and stewardship. It originates and implements many of these programs and understands the technologies, the beneficiaries, and the policy objectives that they serve. Murphy, on the other hand, brings the discipline of ownership and professional management of federal government assets, including governance, accountability, and the imperative to preserve and enhance public value. InfraCorp brings the discipline of making infrastructure projects investable and mobilizing patient long-term capital. In that process, helping to translate infrastructure needs into projects that investors can understand and finance and support over the long term. These are distinct capabilities, and that is precisely the strength of the RAMCO model. Good infrastructure requires technical competency, but sustainable infrastructure requires more. Requires technical, commercial, financial, and governance competence working together. RAMCO is therefore intended to become a professionally governed asset management platform for the nation, not merely another government agency, and certainly not an organization that must perform all of these activities by itself alone. This distinction is important because it leads directly to the role of the private sector. And I am pleased to see many in the room. To our private sector partners that are here today, I would like to emphasize one point. RAMCO represents an opportunity. In fact, I would call it a tremendous opportunity for the private sector. You see, Nigeria's renewable energy economy will require more than solar panels. It will require renewable energy services companies, also called RESCOs. It will require operations and maintenance providers. It will require battery and storage specialists. It will require metering and digital monitoring companies. It will require engineering firms, equipment manufacturers, technology companies, insurers, financial institutions, investors, and entrepreneurs that are developing productive use of reliable electricity. Ladies and gentlemen, what I've just described is the massive local supply chain ecosystem that is needed to support the renewable energy economy that we are creating with RAMCO as the leading edge catalyst for. And of course, government cannot and should not do all of that. RAMCO will help create an organized national platform with a scale and credibility through which this ecosystem can grow and support a globally competitive renewable energy economy right here in Nigeria. It should help establish performance standards, aggregate offtake commitments, improve transparency, create commercially viable pathways through which capable private operators and investors can participate, including opportunities for developers to recover and reinvest their capital into new projects. So RAMCO will not only preserve existing renewable assets, it will help capital to circulate through the renewable energy economy such that today's investments can help finance tomorrow's projects. For investors, this matters because capital does not invest simply because infrastructure is important. Of course it is important. But capital invests when assets are identifiable, performance is measurable, revenues are credible, governance is strong, the risk is understood, and the returns can be reasonably evaluated. If RAMCO can create these conditions across a portfolio of renewable assets, then we will begin to unlock possibilities that individual projects will struggle to achieve, such as portfolio financing, asset-backed structures, blended finance, climate finance, credit enhancement, and eventually even the mobilization of the tremendous substantial pools of long-term institutional and private capital right here at home. So the objective for Nigeria, all of us, must increasingly be to create bankable infrastructure structures rather than assuming that every private investment ultimately requires some sort of government support. And the question of bankability really is precisely the terrain where InfraCorp was created to work in. InfraCorp was established to help mobilize and deploy long-term capital into Nigeria's infrastructure space and to critically transform infrastructure needs into investable project opportunities. We'll all agree that Nigeria cannot close this infrastructure gap with government budgets alone, nor with government guaranteed debt. We also now agree that infrastructure financing and infrastructure sustainability are inseparable. The question, therefore, cannot remain, how do we finance construction? It must become, how do we finance, operate, preserve, optimize, and reinvest in infrastructure throughout the economic life of the infrastructure? RAMCO provides an opportunity to answer that question in a very practical way. And although we begin today with renewable energy, everything I've said, the principles of it are relevant far beyond this sector. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, please permit me to recognize something that is subtle but very important that has brought us here today. You see, institutional interagency collaboration is easy to advocate, but much harder to execute. REA, Murphy, and InfraCorp have different mandates, they've got different perspectives, and they have different areas of expertise. Regardless of these differences, the achievement today is not that we've eliminated these differences. The achievement is that we have intentionally organized our different capabilities around a common national objective. REA doesn't need to become an investment fund. InfraCorp doesn't need to become an electrification agency. Murphy doesn't need to become an engineering company. Each institution is bringing its comparative strength and proactively leveraging those strengths and synergies to work together. I therefore wish to really thank and congratulate Alhaji Abba, MD of REA, and the entire REA team for the vision and the leadership behind this initiative. Absolutely. I also like to thank Dr. Armstrong and our colleagues at Murphy for the exceptional display of partnership spirit. We really thank you for that. Of course, our biggest thanks go to our supervising ministries, the Ministry of Power, Finance, Education, Health, the Budget Office of Federation, and other government institutions that are here supporting this process. And of course, I want to thank our immediate teams across the three institutions that worked so hard to get us to where we are today. So allow me to make one last point. Of course, today's ceremony is not the destination. This is obvious. It is only the beginning. But we are not taking anything for granted. The real test of RAMCO will not be how successful today's launch is. The test will be whether 5 years from today, 10 years from today, the renewable energy assets that have been entrusted to this platform will be working better, lasting longer, serving more Nigerians, attracting more private investment, and preserving more public value because RAMCO exists. That is the standard we have challenged ourselves to. And when we achieve it, RAMCO will be demonstrating something even much bigger, that Nigeria can build infrastructure. And Nigeria can also manage it. Nigeria can preserve it. Nigeria can make infrastructure investable and ensure that the infrastructure that we build today continues creating economic and social value for tomorrow and for the generations to come.